So the Trump administration and the United States military action capturing Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro is triggering a complete tidal wave of domino effects around the world as countries question what everything means right now, but also in some particular cases whether they might be next, and no so more than Cuba. Indeed, the island that has long been a thorn in the side of the world's greatest military and economic power is showing signs of complete collapse. Food shortages, 18-hour blackouts, a complete decimation of the once admired resilient healthcare. Millions are simply leaving, and now this external shock inflection point by the United States and the Trump idea of the Monroe Doctrine is pushing the country's system over the edge. No hurricanes, no failed reforms, just the United States pressure against Venezuela and the critical lifeline of oil that kept Cuba functioning for more than 2 decades. You see, because when Venezuela's oil stops flowing, Cuba doesn't just suffer, it reaches a point of no return, and something that probably the Trump administration would like nothing more, especially Marco Rubio. So in this video, I wanted to explain how what has happened in Venezuela, including the build-up to Operation Absolute Resolve, is impacting Cuba, how Havana has tied its survival so much to previously Hugo Chávez but then Nicolas Maduro's regime, and why the next phase of this crisis could reshape the political future of both countries, but also the Caribbean and, of course, the United States' broader strategic vision. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going? Welcome to the channel, and if you're new, we look at geopolitics, economics, and international relations, and I let you in on an insider perspective towards power and strategy from first-hand experience, be that on the ground in Africa or to the corridors of the UN. Before getting started, I always want to know what you guys think, so do let me know in the comments below how you feel about what we're going to cover in this video, particularly the fallout of Venezuela and its implications for many countries, including some that could be next. Now, prior to the military build-up and pressure from the Trump administration on Venezuela in late 2025, let alone Operation Absolute Resolve itself, you'd be fair in assuming that Cuba's crisis was largely internal, especially due to the US embargo that has existed for 70 plus years. All of this creating a rigid economic system, decades of mismanagement, a state that can no longer feed, power, or employ its population. And all of that is true to an extent. But Cuba's survival has also depended on other factors, especially something external: cheap, subsidized oil from Venezuela. The oil that kept the lights on, the fuel going, and the transportation going. It sustained what little private economic activity still existed. But suddenly that supply has largely been eradicated. The US's external pressure on Venezuela's oil, even before the operation on Friday night, seizing tankers, targeting specific supply networks, and signaling that enforcement would always be aggressive, meant that Havana knew something might be coming, but not quite in the way that it did and at the rate that it did. Now it is simply scrambling. But before going further into current implications, let's have an understanding of why this bilateral relationship between Cuba and Venezuela exists as it does. These two countries have been bound together since 1999, when Hugo Chávez came to power in Venezuela. Chávez framed the relationship as revolutionary solidarity. In reality, though, it was more transactional. Venezuela shipped roughly 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba at heavily subsidized prices. In return, Cuba sent some of their specialist trained doctors, sports trainers, and most importantly, though, security and intelligence advisors, those that had done the remarkable job of sidestepping and counteracting the attempts by the United States to overthrow. Cuban intelligence embedded itself deep inside Venezuela's state and military apparatus, helping Chávez and later Maduro identify dissent, prevent coups, and ideally neutralize rivals. Over time, Venezuela's oil production collapsed under its own mismanagement and corruption. Shipments to Cuba suddenly fell to around 30 barrels per day. Even reduced, that oil though still mattered enormously to Havana. Speed to today, and Venezuela crude covers roughly 40% of Cuba's imported oil. Vital for the power plants, the transport, and the fragile private sector. So removing all that supply, or remnants of it, and Cuba has no immediate substitute at all. So suddenly bring in the United States and the developments in the past 2 to 3 days, and while the United States has not made any formal moves on Cuba, it is without question that something is going to happen, arguably purely because of Marco Rubio's own self-interests and serious intent given his relationship to Cuba. But in practice, it is always about trying to undermine your enemy or adversary psychologically. That seems to be what the Trump administration is trying to do before anything kinetic happens. Prior to the operation, Washington had been targeting Venezuela's tankers, targeting these key shipping networks used to evade sanctions, and expanded its naval presence in the southern Caribbean entirely around southern Cuba. It has increased its enforcement against vessels linked to any sanctioned entities, including those going to Iran, as I covered in another video. One tanker, for example, was already seized carrying nearly 2 million barrels of oil. Crucially, around 70% of Venezuela's crude exports rely on these shadowy shipping networks, which the Cubans themselves would help facilitate. Therefore, the message is unmistakable, that exporting oil under sanctions is only becoming more risky, slower, and more expensive. Anything worse for Cuba. And so then when you consider Operation Absolute Resolve, the Trump administration has demonstrated something far more consequential than sanctions alone. This willingness to use the direct, overwhelming force to remove hostile regimes or entities of any form in the Western Hemisphere. It's not just about symbolic pressure on Cuba anymore or economic sanctions. It's about rapid, unilateral and unapologetic military coercion. For Venezuela, that of course resulted in the going of Maduro. And for Cuba, therefore, it threatens not just the regime, but the entire country's sort of functionality, its survival. And so, as the Venezuelan oil shipments stop, the Cuban economic collapse seems almost inevitable to some. Now, any such collapse would hit a society already in freefall. Cuba has been experiencing its worst economic crisis since the early 1990s, and arguably something even more severe. The economy has contracted roughly 15% since 2018. Cumulative inflation has been around 450% since 2018. The Cuban pesos trades at around 450 to the dollar, on the black market that is, compared with 30 just a few years ago, when the improvement of relations under Obama occurred, from 450. Nearly 90% of the Cuban population lives in extreme poverty. That means less than $1.25 a day, and around 70% just miss regular meals. Blackouts can last 18 hours a day. Hospitals lack medicine, water access is intermittent, garbage piles up in the streets. Things like communicable diseases, dengue, and others are spreading, and school attendance is increasingly irregular, if non-existent completely. For example, since 2020, more than 2.7 Cubans, roughly a quarter of the population, have just left. Now, given that reality, Cuba's recent behavior makes a lot of sense. Havana has tried everything it could to keep Nicolas Maduro in power. Cuban intelligence possibly still remains, deeply embedded inside Venezuela, trying to support what remains of the Maduro government. Former officials describe Cuban counterintelligence as omnipresent, monitoring military officers, senior officials, even ministers. Maduro himself has been surrounded by the trusted Cuban-vetted personnel with tight controls on communications and access. Before that was the Delta Force extracted him. All because for Havana, Maduro's survival was not ideological, it was existential. Lose Maduro and you lose oil, leverage, time. That is why Cuba will not simply fade quietly into the background, as the fallout from Trump's Venezuelan operation only intensifies. Indeed, at the time of recording this video, it's become apparent that over 30 Cubans were killed in the operation. Most of them people assume to be part of security forces or those that were working intelligence associated with the government. And that's why it took slightly longer and there has been a slightly higher casualty rate than was expected, purely because the Cubans were instrumental in ensuring Maduro's protection. But also one wonders why the Cubans, for all their lauding around their capacity for intelligence, didn't see this coming from the Americans. Now, to frame this differently, when it comes to Cuba, it can be tempting and possibly politically convenient to put all the blame on the US for Cuba's hardships. Now, that is not to say that what the Trump administration has done over Venezuela sets an incredibly dangerous precedent and how it will encourage other nation states to behave. The point is the current situation in Cuba is as much structurally and self-inflicted as it is a result of America's actions over Venezuela. You see, the revolution expropriated wealth. The Cuban state crushed independent enterprise, and the economy became so dependent first on the Soviet Union, but then, of course, Venezuela. For example, when global oil prices collapsed in 2014, Venezuelan support began to fade. Cuba's decline accelerated, only slightly alleviated by improvements with the United States relations after Obama opened them up in 2015. The current pressure campaign and subsequent actions in Venezuela by the US therefore did not purely create this crisis. It just simply exposed it. Pressure or actions militarily are not cost-free, and this is where the Venezuelan operation does matter. In the aftermath of absolute resolve, US officials have begun speaking much more openly about this idea of complete regional reshape. Marco Rubio has described the Cuban government as a huge problem when asked directly whether Havana could be next. That remark was of course not offhand, and it's deliberate signaling, perhaps even trolling by the Trump administration. It tells us Washington no longer sees Cuba as a frozen relic to be managed, but as an unresolved strategic liability, even closer to home, and one that props up adversarial regimes, hosts hostile intelligence activity, and, well, yeah, it's only 90 miles from Florida. That's the uncomfortable reality. Removing authoritarian leaders is often not the hardest part. It's the morning after. In Venezuela, there is at least an organized opposition, or so they say, with electoral legitimacy and enormous natural resource wealth, which, depending upon how the political establishment goes, you may well see improve. But even then, any transition will require international financial support to stabilize the economy and meet humanitarian needs. Cuba is a whole different kettle of fish. There is no living memory of democracy. Civil society was dismantled. Institutions barely function. The economy produces almost no hard currency. This regime survives not because it governs effectively, but because it controls security, suppresses dissent, and relies on these external lifelines that no longer exist. What has changed after Operation Absolute Resolve is not just Venezuela's position, it's Washington's posture. Senior officials are talking about the ability to administer Venezuela, but is that the case in Cuba? Or would it become almost like a situation with Puerto Rico, where the United States has to take care of a situation which is increasingly unsustainable? Speaking at Mar-a-Lago, Trump has described Cuba as a very bad failing nation and said it was something the administration would end up talking about or enacting over. He's not framed the issue on ideological terms, but in humanitarian and political ones, helping the Cuban people and those who were forced into exile. But given what his priorities are in Venezuela, that does fall on deaf ears. Of course, Havana, this triggers historical memory. The United States occupied the island twice in the 20th century, and after Fidel Castro's revolution, Washington backed multiple attempts to overthrow the regime, of course the most infamous Bay of Pigs that failed. And that history matters because what happened in Venezuela has revived something the Cuban leadership hoped was gone for good. The sense that regime change in the Caribbean is no longer possible. The response from Havana reflects that fear bluntly. President Miguel Diaz-Canel has denounced the US operation in Venezuela as unacceptable, vulgar, and barbarian kidnapping, calling it a state of terrorism. The language is absolutely, to them, proportionate to the actions. And opinions are never going to be uniform. It's pretty clear there is a lot of ambiguity about how Venezuelans feeling, a difference between the diaspora and those who necessarily live in Venezuela itself. So that will likely be the case with Cubans. Cuba could be next, not because Washington wants another military operation, but because the regime is economically exhausted, strategically exposed, and losing any external support that has kept it alive, forcing the United States to act because the emigration, the refugee flows, will mean the United States is on the receiving end of something it didn't want. But then it gets stuck, it gets bogged down in a country that doesn't have any remnants of institutional framework, of infrastructure, and therefore it becomes a Caribbean version of a nation-building exercise, a quagmire that could be Trump's biggest mistake. Is there a plan for the day after, which is something they didn't consider in the cases of Afghanistan or Iraq? In the Caribbean right now, history is accelerating, and the cost of getting this wrong will be measured on Trump's decision-making, not purely his rhetoric. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this particular angle. A lot of emphasis on who is next. Is it going to be Greenland? Is it going to be Cuba? Is it going to be Iran? None of them are exactly the same, but if anything is going to look most sort of similar in terms of a military kinetic form of action, Cuba does seem to be the most likely and also the most vulnerable and also the one that will potentially be the biggest risk for America. Subscribe and check out the links in the description if you want to see more of my work on Substack or support me further. We'll see you all next time.